The records of war are never complete. They are stitched together from what was allowed to survive, leaving shadows where the truth once stood. In every archive, there are blank spaces, gaps where a signature should have been, pages where ink was carefully removed, corridors where the echo of footsteps fades into silence. What lies in those gaps is more than missing paperwork. It is the memory of choices no one wanted remembered, technology too dangerous to admit, and names that history pretends never existed. These are not stories of the battlefield, where tanks and artillery thundered across open ground, but of locked rooms, sealed crates, and whispered codes traded beneath blackout curtains. They are fragments of secrets buried so deeply that even their silence feels deliberate, as though the world itself conspired to keep them hidden. Tonight, we follow those fragments into the places where the maps end and the darkness begins. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy to Murmansk. The bitter Arctic convoys of the Second World War were among the most perilous missions ever undertaken by Allied sailors. Between 1941 and 1945, a lifeline of merchant vessels carried tanks, aircraft, and ammunition to the Soviet Union through the North Sea, past occupied Norway, and into the frozen harbours of Murmansk and Archangel. Convoy PQ-17, which sailed from Hvalfjordur, Iceland, on 27 June 1942, has long been remembered as one of the greatest Allied disasters of the war. Of the 35 merchant ships that departed, only 11 reached their destination. The official record describes Luftwaffe bombers and U-boats tearing through the scattered formation after Admiralty orders instructed the convoy to disperse. Yet within the National Archives in Kew, researchers uncovered signal logs that suggest another layer of instruction, one that was never recorded in the official after-action report. The coded order carried the designation Black Raven, transmitted from Whitehall in the early hours of 4 July. The message was routed not only to the convoy's escorts, but also to a select handful of merchant captains. Unlike the infamous Scatter Order, which ordered the convoy to break formation, Black Raven carried instructions to divert a portion of the fleet northward, away from the Barents sea lanes, and toward coordinates in the vicinity of Novaya Zemlya. The existence of this directive is supported by fragmented references in Admiralty telegrams filed under Miscellaneous Arctic Directives, July 1942, where the phrase Black Raven vessels accounted separately appears 3 times. The problem is that no after-action report lists which ships those were, and no wrecks corresponding to their disappearance have ever been confirmed. The missing vessels were not insignificant freighters. The Empire Tide, Silver Sword, and John Witherspoon, all fitted with reinforced holds, were known to carry unusual cargo manifests. Soviet requests from March 1942 had included heavy machinery, oil equipment, and munitions. Yet in recently declassified Soviet files from the Ministry of Armaments, an annotation appears beside a requisition form marked Urgent Arctic Shipment, PQ-17. The note, written in Russian cursive, reads, "Cargo not for Stalin. Maintain silence." This annotation was struck out in red pencil, but its presence has fueled speculation among military historians that the convoy carried material intended for Western hands only. American intelligence was also monitoring. An OSS memorandum dated 12 July 1942, retrieved from Record Group Tomb 26 at the U.S. National Archives, bears the title, "Cargo Recovered. Mission Incomplete." Its terse wording offers no detail beyond acknowledging that certain consignments failed to arrive, presumed redirected, final disposition unknown. The ambiguity of this report stands in contrast to the exhaustive detail with which most OSS files tracked Lend-Lease material. This suggests that whatever was aboard the diverted ships was not ordinary cargo, but something considered sensitive enough to be cloaked in obfuscation, even within Allied records. Survivor testimony complicates the story further. In 1974, British naval historian Captain Stephen Roskill interviewed a surviving officer from HMS Keppel, one of the convoy escorts. The officer recalled hearing garbled chatter over the TBS, talk between ships, system referencing, special handling, and diversion north. He was told afterward that these were incorrect intercepts, but decades. Later he insisted the voices belonged to merchant captains from PQ-17. In parallel, a Soviet veteran from the Murmansk naval base, interviewed in 1981 by Pravda journalists, spoke of rumors that foreign ships passed north, never to be seen again. The Arctic itself keeps secrets well. The frigid waters of the Barents Sea preserve wrecks in a state that would elsewhere have decayed long ago. Dozens of merchant vessels lost from PQ-17 have since been discovered by Norwegian and Russian expeditions, their cargo holds still filled with munitions, trucks, and aircraft parts. Yet none of the wrecks correspond to the missing 3 ships associated with Black Raven. Sonar. Surveys of Novaya Zemlya's coastal approaches in 2002 uncovered several anomalies at depths of 80 to 120 meters, but no full-scale expeditions were allowed to examine them. The Russian Ministry of Defense, citing environmental sensitivity due to nuclear testing grounds in the region, denied foreign access. Speculation about the nature of the vanished cargo ranges widely, but often focuses on early fissile material or high-grade industrial components tied to Anglo-American nuclear research. In 1942, the Manhattan Project was in its embryonic phase. Uranium oxide shipments were known to have been transported under extraordinary secrecy from the Belgian Congo to North America, and British research under the Tube Alloys program was proceeding at Harwell. It is not impossible that material or documentation was quietly moved by sea under the cover of Arctic convoys, intended for Anglo-American collaboration, but carefully shielded from Soviet knowledge. Others argue that advanced radar, code-breaking equipment, or captured German technology could have been hidden among the holds. The Silver Sword, in particular, had been outfitted with reinforced shielding in its cargo bay, unusual for a standard merchantman. Naval construction records list this as modification for heavy loads, yet no description specifies what loads. Official denial remains steadfast. The British Ministry of Defence continues to cite only the well-documented scatter order as the cause of PQ-17's disaster. Soviet-era archives that might shed light on diverted ships remain restricted, and many documents from the OSS Arctic section were deliberately destroyed in 1951. During Cold War purges of non-essential wartime files, the absence of conclusive proof ensures that speculation persists, fueled by fragments of testimony, half-erased signals, and the silence of the sea itself. To reconstruct the story is to navigate a fog of missing paperwork and conflicting accounts. The surviving telegrams marked Black Raven exist only in incomplete carbon copies, with entire lines redacted by wartime censors. Testimonies emerge decades later, clouded by failing memory and the natural tendency toward myth-making. Yet the convergence of British, Soviet, and American references to missing ships suggests a pattern too consistent to dismiss as mere rumor. What remains is an unresolved question etched into Arctic waters. Why were certain ships diverted? What was so important that it required secrecy even from the Soviet ally for whom the convoy was ostensibly organized? And why, after 80 years, do governments on both sides continue to maintain silence about a tragedy already so well documented in blood and steel? The convoy's survivors remembered the crack of bombs, the flames on the horizon, and the endless cold. But hidden beneath those memories is another story, one of deliberate erasure, whispered code names, and vanished vessels whose true destination was never Murmansk. In the long night of July 1942, 3 ships sailed away into darkness, obeying an order never meant to be recorded, and into waters where history itself froze alongside them. Chapter 2. Operation Eclipse and the Disappearing Generals. By early April 1945, the German Reich was in collapse. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, while British and American armies crossed the Rhine and swept into the heart of Germany. In this chaotic moment, the Allies devised Operation Eclipse, the plan for dividing and occupying the territory of the defeated Reich. On paper, Eclipse was straightforward: secure major cities, seize communications, and arrest senior military and political leaders. Yet hidden among the maps and orders of battle lies a darker layer of the occupation. Between May and July 1945, at least a dozen German generals slated for arrest by Allied commands simply disappeared. Their names were crossed off arrest lists without explanation. Their surrender locations were noted and then erased. No graves, no trials, no official fate. Among the most notable was General Erich Buschenhagen, implicated in the brutal repression of partisans in Norway and northern Russia. His name appears in SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, document AEF 5-11, titled Arrest Priority List Category 1. Yet by June 1945, a handwritten annotation in the margin reads, handled separately. The file trail ends there. Buschenhagen never appeared in Soviet custody, and he was never listed at Nuremberg. Another case involves General Walter Dornberger, head of the V-weapons program. Dornberger was arrested, but his immediate transfer into American custody bypassed standard Eclipse procedures. Within months, he was quietly relocated to the United States under the paperclip program. In Bavaria, where American and British units advanced rapidly through scattered Wehrmacht resistance, entire convoys of staff officers were seen moving along designated corridors. Internal memoranda from the US 7th Army mention no engagement orders in effect around Mittenwald and Garmisch-Partenkirchen, corridors that coincided with escape routes used by senior Wehrmacht figures. Locals later recalled heavily guarded motorcades traveling by night, escorted by American military police, yet with their markings obscured. A surviving entry in the 12th Army Group's operations diary notes cryptically, Convoy West, priority clearance, 15th May. Cargo not for disclosure. The Soviets were quick to notice. In 1946, a classified NKVD report accused Western allies of deliberately shielding German officers with expertise in frontline rocket engineering, anti-armor weapons design, and chemical research. The report listed names including Hans Kammler, architect of underground weapons facilities, and Dr. Kurt Blome, Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich, whose research into biological warfare had drawn Moscow's attention. Kammler was officially reported dead by suicide in May 1945 near Prague. Yet CIA records declassified in the 1990s contain references to Kammler's files being reviewed in occupied Germany in late 1945, months after his supposed death. The evidence of deliberate exfiltration deepens with the discovery of altered arrest lists. A British War Office document, WO208 4177, contains two versions of the Eclipse arrest roll. In the first, compiled in early April 1945, 26 generals are named. In the revised June version, 14 of those names are missing without explanation. Later annotations state duplicates removed, yet none of those officers appear in any other arrest category or trial record. It is as if they were administratively erased. By 1947, scattered reports place some of the missing men in South America. Argentine intelligence archives, partially declassified in the 1990s, describe the arrival of engineers and staff officers via Genoa and Barcelona, traveling on Red Cross passports. One such report names General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, last seen in British captivity. Officially, he died in England in 1948. Yet Argentine documents describe a man matching his description arriving in Buenos Aires in 1946, accompanied by a German industrialist known for his contacts with I.G. Farben. Washington's motives were clear. The rapid onset of the Cold War turned yesterday's war criminals into today's assets. Expertise in rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical warfare, and armored doctrine became currency. Project Paperclip openly recruited scientists, but the recruitment of generals and SS officers was cloaked behind layers of deniability. A 1948 CIA memorandum acknowledged informal transfers of German military personnel, citing strategic necessity. No further details were included. In Britain, the silence was equally deliberate. Parliamentary inquiries in the early 1950s into the fate of missing German officers were dismissed as administrative anomalies. Yet a private letter from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to General Eisenhower, held in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, contains an enigmatic remark. Certain elements handled outside of Eclipse. The less said, the better. The Soviet Union exploited these disappearances in propaganda, accusing the West of harboring fascists. Pravda articles in 1949 named several generals who had supposedly been recruited by the Americans. Though dismissed as Cold War rhetoric, later discoveries confirmed elements of truth. For example, General Reinhard Gehlen, former head of German intelligence on the Eastern Front, surrendered to the Americans in May 1945. He was not turned over to the Soviets despite their demands. Instead, he was quietly flown to Washington, where he struck a deal that led to the creation of the Gehlen Organization, the nucleus of West Germany's future intelligence service. Yet the more sinister question remains. What became of those who disappeared without trace? Some undoubtedly reached South America, living under new identities with the protection of sympathetic regimes. Others may have been absorbed into clandestine Western military research programs, their names struck from records to avoid scandal. Still others could have been silenced altogether, eliminated once their usefulness waned. The absence of graves, testimonies, or trial records leaves only fragments. A redacted OSS file titled Eclipse Supplements mentions extractions complete, 12 units secured. No context is given. A British signals report from July 1945 references intercepted Soviet complaints about missing cargo, living, and in a locked drawer of the Bundesarchiv, a 1952 memo acknowledges incomplete accounting for certain surrendered generals. Further inquiry inadvisable. For the families of those officers, silence became their only inheritance. Letters went unanswered. Widow pensions were quietly approved, despite the absence of death certificates. Official biographies listed dates of death that matched no known events. The bureaucratic neatness of the erasures suggests not carelessness but design. Today, historians comb through archives, piecing together names and movements, but the trail remains fragmented. Operation Eclipse, intended as the orderly transition to peace, became instead a cover for selective amnesia. Behind its maps and directives lies a shadow operation in which generals vanished not into chaos, but into the custody of those who found them too useful to surrender, too dangerous to expose, and too valuable to leave behind. The collapse of Nazi Germany ended the war, but in its ruins, another conflict was already beginning. And in that transition, the fates of men once branded as criminals were rewritten in silence, their disappearances buried beneath the administrative machinery of occupation. The war did not end for them, it simply changed masters. Chapter 3. The Hidden Tunnels of Prora Complex. On the Baltic island of Rügen, along the shores of the Prora Wiik, stands one of the most unsettling relics of the Third Reich, the Prora Resort Complex. Constructed between 1936 and 1939 under the Nazi Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy program, the sprawling concrete structure stretched nearly 4.5 kilometers along the shoreline, intended as a massive seaside retreat for German workers. Its sheer scale earned it the nickname the Colossus of Prora. Officially, construction ceased when war broke out, with resources redirected to armaments. Yet aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by the Royal Air Force in 1944, long classified within the Bundesarchiv, reveal irregularities beneath the complex that cannot be explained by an unfinished holiday resort. The photos show disturbed earth patterns, secondary ventilation shafts, and track-like markings leading inland from the resort's foundations. Analysts in 1944 annotated the photos with the phrase, "possible subterranean works." When the Red Army occupied Rügen in May 1945, Soviet engineers immediately sealed off the northern half of Prora. Witness reports from local residents describe days of truck convoys entering the complex, many covered by tarpaulins, escorted by NKVD troops. A Soviet military decree issued in June 1945 declared large sections of Prora a restricted military zone. No German civilian was permitted entry until the 1950s. The hidden works became clearer in 1951, when East German construction units attempted to repurpose parts of the resort. In Stasi Film MFS Hatrai 257, a report describes workers accidentally breaking into a bricked-up tunnel beneath Block 4. The tunnel led downward into a reinforced concrete corridor, lined with rusted rail tracks. According to the report, the air was heavy with chemicals, and markings in faded Gothic script labelled Kühlraum, cooling chamber, and Maschinenraum were found. The corridor extended for at least 200 meters before collapsing under seawater intrusion. The Stasi sealed the breach with concrete and classified the report. Further anomalies were recorded in seismic surveys carried out by the East German Academy of Sciences in the 1960s, while ostensibly measuring soil stability for coastal erosion studies. The surveys detected hollow cavities beneath the central section of Prora. Some of the voids measured over 20 meters in width. A later Stasi memo speculated about abandoned military-industrial installations, but concluded that excavation was not recommended due to contamination risks. What kind of contamination remained unspecified, though fishermen from the nearby village of Binz claimed that in certain summers the seawater glowed faintly at night, a phenomenon dismissed by local officials as phosphorescent algae. Theories about what Prora concealed have multiplied. Some point to the German nuclear research program. Though less advanced than Allied or Soviet efforts, evidence exists that uranium enrichment experiments took place in Thuringia and Silesia. Prora's remote location and reinforced subterranean chambers could have served as testing grounds for reactor components or isotope separation. Others argue the site housed weapons development unrelated to atomic research. Documents from the organization TOT mention Bovorhaben Nord 322, a project requiring specialized ventilation and heavy-gauge steel reinforcement. No project by that number has ever been identified, and the numbering system places it in the timeline of late-war wonder weapons initiatives. Captured German engineers interrogated by Allied intelligence after the war occasionally hinted at Rügen. In a transcript from the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, CSDIC, one engineer stated, "On the island, we built something greater than a hotel." The statement was dismissed as exaggeration, yet the phrasing matches the growing suspicion that Prora was more than a holiday camp turned barracks. When East Germany fell in 1989, the archives of the Stasi offered another glimpse. File X-Vers 287, marked Verschlusssache Top Secret, contains correspondence from 1959 reporting repeated break-ins by local youths into sealed Prora basements. Several became ill afterward, suffering from skin lesions and respiratory distress. The report concludes, potential exposure to residual substances. Access must remain prohibited. In 1960, the East German military flooded lower levels of Prora with brine pumped directly from the Baltic, claiming it was for stabilization. The decision ensured that any remaining structures or contents would be preserved in salt water and rendered inaccessible. In 2002, joint German-Russian research teams conducted limited dives off Rügen as part of a survey of wartime wrecks. Unofficial accounts from divers circulated in naval circles describe encountering metal piping and collapsed tunnel mouths extending offshore. Some claimed the tunnels connected directly to undersea launch shafts, though no photographic evidence was released. The Russian Ministry of Defense quickly classified the findings, citing concerns about unexploded ordnance. Skeptics argue that Prora's supposed tunnels are simply storage cellars or unfinished basements misinterpreted by later observers. Yet the persistence of restricted access, the documented Stasi reports, and the consistent secrecy from both Soviet and East German authorities undermine the skeptical view. Few civilian projects in East Germany received such tight control for so many decades. What purpose could justify such concealment? If Prora contained a reactor experiment, the contamination warnings would make sense. If it housed weapons research, the convoys of Soviet trucks in 1945 may have carried away prototypes or documentation. A less technological, but equally disturbing possibility is that Prora served as a holding site for forced laborers or prisoners subjected to experimentation. Several testimonies from survivors of nearby Peenemünde facilities spoke of transport to the island, never to return. The truth of Prora's tunnels lies buried under concrete, brine, and decades of silence. The resort today has been partially converted into hostels and museums, its long grey facades repurposed for tourism, yet entire wings remain sealed, and local officials discourage exploration of the basements. The official narrative emphasizes its role as a symbol of Nazi propaganda, a failed holiday project. But in the sealed corridors beneath, whispers of another story endure, of reinforced rails, chemical traces, and vanished chambers deliberately drowned. If the walls of Prora could speak, they would tell of something built in the shadows of the Baltic, hidden under the guise of leisure architecture, and erased by regimes that found its truth too dangerous to reveal. 70 years after the war, the Colossus of Prora still casts a shadow not only on the beach of Rügen, but on the unfinished record of what Nazi Germany built, buried, and abandoned in the desperate final years of the Reich. Chapter 4: The Shadow Fleet of Haifa Bay. When the British mandate in Palestine neared its violent end in 1948, the Mediterranean waters around Haifa were thick with patrol craft, smuggling boats, and departing Royal Navy vessels. Amid this chaos, a strange flotilla appeared offshore, rusting merchantmen flying the flags of Greece, Panama, and Honduras. To the casual observer, these ships seemed like derelicts bound for scrapyards, relics of the war years being stripped of value before being sunk. Yet MI6 intercepts, filed under the cryptic label Project Triton, tell a different story. These were not harmless hulks. They were former Kriegsmarine auxiliaries, repurposed and repainted, carrying cargo that official records do not admit ever existed. The first mention of the fleet appears in a British Admiralty communiqué dated 3 May 1948. It describes the presence of 7 unmarked merchant craft lying at anchor outside Haifa Bay, with no visible crew on deck and no declared manifests. A marginal note in pencil reads, likely ex-German hulls, origin, Adriatic. 2 days later, local dock workers reported heavily guarded barges unloading at night. The crates were marked only with stenciled numbers. No customs inspections were performed, and the shipments were driven directly inland under British military escort. What was in those crates? A US Navy memorandum from 1950, declassified decades later, provides a hint. The file, coded ONI-ME 421, refers to German origin materials diverted toward Levant operations. The language is vague, but the memo notes components consistent with V2 guidance assemblies. If true, the Shadow Fleet may have been the vehicle by which fragments of Nazi missile technology entered the Middle East. Bypassing both Allied oversight and international law, Israeli sources suggest another angle. In the black files of the Mossad, established only in 1949, a brief entry mentions coffins of steel arriving in the early days of statehood. The phrase is believed by historians to refer not to human remains, but to sealed containers housing weapon parts. Given the desperate need for arms during the War of Independence, clandestine deliveries would not have been unusual. Yet the origin, ex-Kriegsmarine ships, raises uncomfortable questions. Who authorized their transfer? And why cloak them in layers of deception? One possibility is that the British themselves facilitated the shipments. As their mandate crumbled, London sought to secure influence in the region through back channels. Supplying controlled amounts of advanced weaponry, or at least the promise of it, could have provided leverage with both Jewish and Arab factions. A fragmentary MI6 field report from June 1948 refers to leverage assets, maritime origin classified. The wording suggests precisely such a balancing act, with material allowed to move under deniable circumstances. The Soviet Union, for its part, accused the West of smuggling fascist technology into the region. A Pravda editorial in September 1949 claimed that Nazi weapons sail again under foreign flags. Western diplomats dismissed the charge as propaganda. Yet recently examined Soviet naval intercept logs reveal that Soviet submarines shadowed several of the Haifa-bound ships, reporting unusual deck cargo secured with naval-grade fittings. The Soviets suspected missile components or chemical stocks. The fate of the ships themselves deepens the mystery. Of the 7 vessels noted in the original Admiralty communiqué, only 2 can be accounted for in post-war registries. The others simply vanished from maritime records after 1949. No scrapping certificates exist, no subsequent sales are logged. They disappear as if erased. Some researchers believe they were scuttled deliberately in deep waters off Cyprus, their cargo already unloaded. Others suspect they were quietly absorbed into clandestine supply chains serving emerging Middle Eastern states. Testimony from dock workers at Haifa adds human texture to the puzzle. One recalled, in a 1961 oral history, being forced at gunpoint to load crates onto military lorries. He described a chemical stench that lingered after the loading, burning his nostrils. Another remembered the crates as unusually heavy, requiring winches and chains. The memory haunted him. We were told nothing, but we knew it was not rifles or bullets. It was something worse. Project Triton's surviving files are sparse, many destroyed in the 1970s, yet one cable remains. Dated 12th May 1948, from the MI6 station in Nicosia to London headquarters. It reads, Fleet assets secured, transfers ongoing, final destination redacted. The use of the word redacted in the cable itself suggests that the information was deliberately withheld even from parts of MI6. Someone higher up had compartmentalized the operation. To an unusual degree, in the absence of full records, speculation has flourished. Some believe the fleet carried nerve agents developed in late-war German labs, precursors to the sarin and tabun that terrified Allied intelligence. If so, their transfer to the Middle East would explain both the secrecy and the disappearance of the ships. Others argue the fleet carried uranium ore or refining equipment, remnants of the aborted Nazi atomic program. Such a possibility aligns with Soviet accusations, though no physical evidence has surfaced. The silence of official archives suggests one conclusion above all. Whatever the Shadow Fleet carried, it was not meant to be remembered. Governments on all sides found it more convenient to erase the record than to explain it. Today, Haifa's harbour bustles with commerce, its shoreline lined with cranes and container yards. Few remember the nights in 1948 when ghost ships lay offshore. Guarded convoys moved under blackout, and the cargo that could not be named slipped silently into the newborn struggles of the Middle East. The war in Europe had ended, but its weapons had not. They drifted east, hidden in rusting hulls and false flags, shaping a conflict that was only just beginning. The shadow fleet of Haifa Bay remains a phantom in the archives, a reminder that wars do not end with peace treaties. They continue in silence, through steel crates and erased files, long after the guns fall silent. Chapter 5. The Ciphers of the Argentine Safehouses. In the years after 1945, South America became the destination for thousands of fugitives from the fallen Reich. Most were small men, former SS guards, minor bureaucrats, camp doctors, who vanished into the vastness of Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Paraguay. But in Buenos Aires, buried inside police reports and later CIA files, lies evidence that the network of escape was more than a disorganized scattering. It was structured, encoded, and maintained by a secret communications chain hidden in ordinary boarding houses. These became known in US and British intelligence cables as the Paraguay Street Safehouses. The first clue came during a police raid in 1947. Acting on rumors of illegal currency exchanges, Buenos Aires detectives stormed a nondescript pension at 8157 Calle Paraguay. Inside, they found German expatriates huddled over notebooks filled with cipher groups, strings of 5-letter codes written in neat columns. The arrest report lists the codes as meaningless, but a margin note in the case file adds patterns similar to German war ciphers. Within 24 hours, every man arrested was released. No charges were filed. The notebooks were transferred to military custody, and the police were warned off further action. Years later, fragments of those notebooks resurfaced in a declassified CIA dossier. The report, dated 1952 and titled German Networks, Southern Hemisphere, describes the ciphers as derivative of Enigma protocol, but adapted for field transmission. The Americans had partially broken some of the messages. One read, "Files burned in Berlin," "Copies secured in Cordoba." Another, still only half solved, carried the chilling phrase, "Night compass will continue." What night compass meant has never been discovered. The role of the Argentine government remains murky. President Juan Perón publicly denied harboring war criminals, yet his intelligence services issued Red Cross passports to scores of Germans, often with Vatican intermediaries. In the case of the Calle Paraguay boarding houses, police logs show raids were conducted multiple times between 1947 and 1950. Each time suspects were quietly released, often within hours. On one occasion, the police chief himself ordered the men freed, citing instructions from higher authority. The safehouses functioned as more than shelters. According to British SIS assessments, they operated as signal hubs. Couriers arrived by ship from Europe, carrying microfilm hidden in diplomatic pouches or sewn into clothing. These were processed in the safehouses and redistributed to sympathizers across the continent. Intercepted letters from Hamburg to Buenos Aires contain phrases like, "Your uncle's health remains good." Documents are being recopied. The letters were coded in mundane language, but corresponded closely with the cipher notebooks. One CIA field officer, writing from Montevideo in 1951, reported that the German community maintains a disciplined courier chain linking Buenos Aires, Cordoba, and Asunción. The officer added that the chain was financed through industrial front firms, some of which later became major players in Argentina's automotive and chemical sectors. These firms provided cover employment for arriving Germans while laundering money into the network. The mystery deepens with the testimony of former OSS officer John O'Donnell, who appeared before the US Senate in 1960. He claimed that the war crimes that survived the war did so in code, not in testimony. According to O'Donnell, the ciphers in Argentina contained lists of names, assets, and locations of hidden files smuggled out of Europe before Germany fell. He asserted that entire sections of Gestapo and SS archives had been microfilmed and sent south, where they remained in circulation long after the Allies declared them destroyed. Supporting evidence comes from Argentine customs records. In 1946, crates labeled as farm machinery parts were unloaded at the port of Buenos Aires from a Spanish freighter. The crates were taken to a warehouse in Retiro, signed for by a German shipping agent later identified as an SS veteran. Weeks later, several of the crates were moved to Cordoba, The trail ends there. None of the crates were ever inventoried, and their contents remain unknown. British intercept stations in Cyprus and Gibraltar also noted unusual radio traffic in the late 1940s. Signals were faint, irregular, and often relayed through merchant shipping frequencies. Analysts concluded they were encoded using modified Wehrmacht hand ciphers. The origin was traced not to Europe, but to transmitters believed to be operating from within Buenos Aires. The safehouses were not just hubs for couriers, they were actively transmitting. By the mid-1950s, the network began to unravel. Several of its suspected leaders vanished or died under suspicious circumstances. One, a former SS adjutant, was found drowned in the Rio de la Plata, with his pockets filled with stones. Another was killed in a supposed car accident on the road to Rosario. Both deaths coincided with increased Mossad activity in Argentina, suggesting targeted operations. Yet even as individuals disappeared, the ciphers themselves kept resurfacing. In 1958, police in Mendoza seized a ledger from a German innkeeper containing identical 5-letter groupings to those found a decade earlier in Buenos Aires. The legacy of these codes remains unresolved. Did they conceal lists of fugitive identities, treasure maps to hidden assets, or archives of atrocities? Theories abound. Some historians believe they contained evidence of secret negotiations between fleeing Nazis and Allied intelligence, bargaining protection in exchange for information. Others argue they documented the location of looted gold and art. A more sinister possibility is that they preserved technical knowledge, rocketry, chemical warfare, biological experiments, too valuable to lose. Whatever their content, the Argentine ciphers prove that the war's paper trail did not end in Berlin's flames. It was recopied, encrypted, and carried across oceans to safehouses hidden behind modest doors in Buenos Aires. There, under the guise of boarding houses and immigrant clubs, men in exile continued to transmit the shadows of a war the world wanted to forget. Today, the buildings on Calle Paraguay stand renovated, their histories whitewashed. Tourists stroll past cafes and apartment blocks with no inkling that in those same walls, cipher pads once concealed the continuation of a regime that had supposedly been defeated. The safehouses are gone, but the codes they produced remain, unbroken fragments of a dark communication chain that stitched together the afterlife of the Third Reich in exile. In every unsolved string of letters lies the possibility that history's missing pages were not lost at all, but hidden, waiting in plain sight on the streets of Buenos Aires. What has been erased is never truly gone. Beneath layers of dust and silence, the fragments endure. A coded message that should not exist. A tunnel bricked over too carefully. A convoy that sailed toward nowhere. They remind us that history is not only what is written, but also what is hidden, suppressed, or deliberately forgotten. The war may have ended in surrender and parades, yet its shadows remain, woven into steel, ink, and rumor. Somewhere, behind closed doors and beneath locked vaults, the untold chapters still wait. They do not rest quietly, for silence is fragile, and even the deepest burial cannot keep secrets from breathing. What is concealed shapes what we believe is truth, and what slips through those fractures reveals the war that never truly ended. The question is not whether the secrets remain, but how long we dare to look away before the silence finally breaks.